big story this week.
Nah, not really to talk about, is there? No one person in particular.
I don't know what you're on about.
I feel like I need to wind you up and just let you go on this, but then we could have a potential lawsuit on our hands. So maybe we won't go down that route. But obviously, go on.
Yeah. Well, obviously, we're talking about certain Daniel Kinahan, aren't we? And his name has reared its head once again this week in British and worldwide boxing, really. Seems to be more serious than ever. Like, this announcement has really got people going, and sanctioned by the US government. If anyone's been under a rock this week, a whole list of sanctions and threats and bounties on his head and everything. And so it's cast its eye over Pro Bellum and MTK and his involvement with fighters at home and abroad. So he's back. Not that he's ever gone away, and I think that's one of our arguments that, again, if you have been living under a rock for the last, I don't know, we started this 2015, it's now 2022. It doesn't take a genius to work out who's been or was behind MTK, Global, and Pro Bellum, does it? But his name is back on the front pages and the back pages again this week, and it seems to whip everyone into a frenzy when it comes around. And is it same as it ever was? Is it this? This does seem like a very significant development, and so maybe he's going to watch his space. It's going to be interesting to see how it plays out, and interesting to see who has questions to answer. At some point in the future, maybe. I don't know. It's all hypothetical at this stage. He's still in Dubai, we believe. You know what I mean? And Pro Bellum and MTK have both come out and released statements distancing themselves from him, as seems to be the norm when his name gets mentioned. So here we are.
I think I'm chucking some sort of disclaimer that anything we're talking about is obviously alleged at this point, but I don't know whether you need to necessarily do that or not, because obviously it seems to have taken a shift for me. Now, I've obviously tried to read little bits, and I've watched a couple of videos. I know Martin at New Age Boxing did a bit on pitch boxing with I think it was Kieran Cunningham, chief sports journalist for the Irish Daily Star. And he was saying, I know there's been a few journalists in particular, obviously in Ireland, really sort of I don't know how to word it, but trying to promote and being constant with their obviously criticism of Daniel Kinahan's involvement in boxing and very vocal about it. And there seems to be a bit of a shift with this latest sanction being put in place because it's the US government. What he was saying was that basically there's been sort of efforts in the past from Ireland, from the UK, and indeed Spain to try and extradite Daniel Kinahan from his current, again, I don't know the current location in Dubai, but it's not been reciprocated. Whereas because America are getting involved now, there may be a bit more action taking place. So I think with that in mind, that if something comes of it, it could have really big, long-lasting repercussions throughout boxing, because by all accounts, it is rumoured that Daniel Kinahan has a huge reach within boxing. He represents, in some way, shape or form, hundreds, potentially thousands of professional boxers. And from what you mentioned at the start of, when we first started covering BBB, even before then, he was sort of rumoured to be involved with the initial MGM Marbella, wasn't it? It was him and Matt Macklin were reportedly friendly or close friends, and they'd set up the thing together. And again, I don't remember, and I'm not dismissing this by any means, I don't remember there being too much of a sort of uproar. There may well have been, and again, it might have been this sort of, reported of what he's alleged to have done, what's gone on, and this talking about crime cartels and all sorts going on. But the nature of boxing has unfortunately lent itself to someone like Kinahan being able to become involved in right up to the highest level.
Highest.
At various points over the past however many years, there's been little sort of rumours of it, and various companies they've done this week, obviously MTK, Pro Bellum, there's been other sort of promoters, other sanctioning bodies, fighters, etc., coming out and basically denying any involvement. But then there almost seems to be various points throughout the timeline where there's almost U-turns on it, and it's like, are they sort of just dipping their toes into the water to try and make it public? Like, I don't know the bloke, despite what people on Twitter were saying, like, about us potentially, being in bed with or under the influence of or whatever. Like, we don't know him, never met him, never had anything to do with him. We can only comment on sort of what's out there publicly, what certain boxers talk to us about privately. But it's not any secret that there are several very high-profile British boxers who seemingly owe a lot to Daniel Kinahan, whether that's in an official capacity, whether that's in some sort of unofficial advisory role, whether it's as a friend and he's just giving general advice, like whatever. I think it's interesting this time, as I say, that there seems to be more official action, and I don't know whether I've said this on the pod and on Twitter or just sort of messaging you and the lads. Like, I think until there is some sort of formal conviction or formal action like taken against him, I think it's very easy for everyone in boxing, us included to a certain extent, but I'm talking about people actually within the sport that would work with him and work with fighters he supposedly, again, allegedly represents or not. It's very easy for everyone to just bury their head in the sand because of how fragmented the sport is, and it's now at the point where, like, if you look at however many boxers are MTK or Probellum more recently, they have a huge reach within the sport.
Massive.
And I think it's now at the point where something, like, unless something is done or there's significant developments from a prosecution point of view, nothing's necessarily going to change. Like, will they just wait again and hope it all dies down? I mean, if it doesn't, that's obviously the story in itself, isn't it? If something then comes up, this to me seems a bit more significant than like the BBC Panorama thing that came out, for example. That was very easy to brush under the carpet, and even we were a bit blasé about it, in that, like, it didn't, for anyone who knew about it, it didn't really present anything new or significant in terms of like updates on it. It was just a bit more of the same, maybe brought to a wider audience.
I think it's a good point. I think, obviously, to echo what you just said there, like, I think obviously being sanctioned by the US government and is a lot more hard hitting, I think, than a BBC Panorama documentary. And it's probably put the shit up them this week, I imagine. Like, and there's associates and stuff. It's a bit you up there with pretty big names and big gangs and what have you now. And I think, like, there seems to be points where he maybe seems to relax and he goes over to Dubai and he's pictured it arm in arm with fighters and stuff. And, he's naming his services again. And maybe some would argue, allegedly, that is his way of sort of sport washing and trying to legitimize himself as a boxing businessman. Again, all this is hypothetical. We're just saying what we see, but, the careful way about it. But it's going to be interesting. It is. Obviously is, again, alleged his biggest client or advisor or whatever you want to call him has got a massive fight at Wembley Stadium next week in front of 94,000. Tyson Fury, public records on Instagram, Twitter, name checking Daniel Kinahan, over the years. So they're probably still all there for people to see, I'm sure. I'm sure there's going to be extra scrutiny on that fight week now. I think there'll be more of your front page journalists trying to gate crash that press conference than just sport journalists determined to stick a microphone under Tyson's nose and ask him about it. Maybe Frank Warren as well. And there is that, thing that you hear, like, being in boxing or fringe media or whatever, you hear things secondhand. And there's that thing where you hear, without him, like, how ingrained is he? How ingrained now MTK Global and Probellum in British boxing and worldwide boxing? You'd have to say very, like, could it exist without them? And it's like, honestly, if Tyson Fury, the biggest fighter in the country, Joshua has been linked closely to them this week. You just think, I don't know, it's as easy as pulling the plug on them and fighters just find other management and off you go. I don't know. Like, they've got close links with Frank Warren, with Eddie Hearn, like, some of Matchroom's biggest fighters are managed by MTK, advised by them. Like, who a lot of people could be asked questions about this in the next few weeks and months and have hard-hitting questions to answer and decisions to make. Again, if anything comes of it, who knows?
I think you've, again, whether you meant to or not, but you've alluded there to like the word sport washing, and that's essentially what it is, because initially, or during one of the previous times that Daniel Kinahan was mentioned publicly by boxers, was with Tyson Fury, and it was when the Joshua fight had been made, and Fury came out, didn't he, with a little video and tweets and stuff saying like this fight could not have been made without Daniel Kinahan, and like he, he's my advisor, whatever, he's helped get this done. And then I think the other sort of parties, Matchroom in particular, was sort of like, well, it's not down to us, like who is representing Tyson Fury, that we've got to deal with other fighters and their advisors and different things like that. And again, I think that's been sort of testament of what a lot of people in boxing, whether the media, the promoters, the boxers, and like what they've done about it or not done about it. And again, I'm sort of referring to us on the fringe media side of things as well, because it's almost just accepted, and like whether that's right or wrong, that's very much up for debate, and I can definitely see why people would criticize that, because it's almost that separation, isn't it? You like John O'Carroll today, for example, in the last couple of days, like he's been sort of doubling down on his defence, and people were openly asking him about like all these crimes and being accused of murder and God knows what else. And John O'Carroll's like, I don't know about that. Like he's been good to me. He's always been sound with me. And that in a nutshell, and I'm picking on one example there, but that in a nutshell is why boxing has been so ripe to this sort of thing, because like morally, the sport is often an absolute cesspit. Like there's no way around that. Like you've got a lot of individuals and huge general sweeping statements here that will come from these broken backgrounds. They'll be, they'll know people that are involved in drugs, and it's on some level. And I dare say that they won't be bothered by it necessarily in the way that your man on the street would, and that in itself like helps that sort of thing. I think from our point of view, like again, it seems like it's almost, I need to be careful what I'm saying, but like it's almost comparable with like drugs cheats in the sport, and to the point of like dodgy refereeing decisions and judging decisions and stuff. It seemed like, having followed the sport, that every so often it crops up and people really are like outraged by it, and then it dies down again, and
there's a pattern there.
It goes a bit cloak and dagger, and it's not as public, and then they sort of again test the waters a few months later or a year later, and a few more fighters mention him, or they're seen pictured with him in Dubai, as you say, and I think again, I do think the whole sport has just become a bit blasé to everything, and without and it's all been like, it's like, well, one of the, apart from like how good a bloke he is and how well he treats boxers and stuff, it's like this line that he is good for boxing. And again, I think there is an argument for that, because if he's getting boxing fights made and he's representing a lot of the fighters, he's in as good a position as anyone to enhance the sport. What you then got to ask is, do the end or the alleged ends justify the means? And obviously, I'm not one to sit and answer. I don't know is the answer. I think that's what is then going to sort of come about. And when the likes of the US government at that level are getting involved, we've already seen Frank Smith from Matchroom peddling the lawyer's line of like no comment, Matchroom do everything by the book, etc., etc. I think it's going to be a little bit harder for, as you said, Tyson Fury, Hank Warren to play that sort of card, like especially if there are non-boxing media there and more mainstream, because they might be a bit more like a dog with a bone. They're not going to just sort of accept that as an answer, or
well, I think
it's going to bring a lot higher level of scrutiny to it all.
Well, that's the thing, and I think boxing is the perfect sport for people of alleged characters like him, and because we've all, I say we, are boxing, in its many forms, as in fighters, fans, media, etc. Boxing has let this monster grow. Like he rebranded MTK under everyone's very nose without a squeak. You know what I mean? It's like a new name. allegedly moved fighters over, and like, you know, some of the best people I've met in boxing are MTK fighters and people and stuff, and Probellum people, and it's like, you know, that's what you said. Do people care? And you have to tread so carefully on that, because I know people in Ireland do, and there is, you know, there is a consistent few on Twitter, I get that care about it, but there's also people, you know, is it a lot of for outrage? I don't know. That's another discussion to sort of to get into, but you know, boxing, there's that other argument, you know. Do you want to go back to the days of the mob? How far do you go back and look at characters and chances and alleged crooks and that in boxing and mobster? You know, like, the sport lends itself to these types, and there's no guarantee it won't happen again. You just don't know. But
no, and I disagree, to be honest, that like just because it's had these historical sort of links, that then
I just think like, that it's ungoverned, isn't it? But there's no governance, though, is there?
This is the issue. It's a lot easier said than done, because there's no accountability, there's no governance. Everyone at the top can just sort of pass the buck nicely around themselves. And we've seen it in like previous, as I said, like with promoters who aren't necessarily linked, pushing the book and just sort of, oh well, you know, we've got to work with whoever, and that's like absolute bollocks in itself, because like we talked in an earlier example, like Eddie Hearn and Frank Warren don't voluntarily do business together, and that's just purely because they're sort of rivals in what they do. So if they really didn't want to deal with Daniel Kinahan, they could arguably bite their nose off to spite their face, but they could make that stand. It's the same. That's why I was making the comparison with like convicted drugs abusers and stuff, because all the major promoters have got power in that sense. They could say, no, like, you failed the test, we don't want to work with you. But then, like, Canelo makes them so much money that it's obviously worth doing it and bending over backwards. And like, that's one example. But like Povetkin, how many shows has he been on over here? Like, when they fail these tests, the worst thing under the sun in the eyes of some. Yet, from a business point of view, it makes sense, and I dare say that's the case with Kinahan himself, with MTK, with Probellum, with whoever you want to link with him. Like, I think,
but it's massive though, isn't it? But MTK and Probellum, like the companies that who both released statements due to the alleged links with him, it's like, they are massive, and their reach in boxing is huge, and boxing has let that monster grow now for many years, probably getting on a decade, if not more. And it's like, as the ship's probably sailed, you know what I mean? Like, the biggest country are MTK fighters, and if you're going to blackball them and blacklist them, then it hasn't happened yet, has it? And it doesn't seem to be happening.
This is why I said about biting the nose off to spite the face, because it would be an incredibly bold and tough thing to do. Now, it's obviously already started a little bit, if like with Top Rank and whatever, having saying that like they're having no sort of deal with Probellum, but then Probellum have come out and said, well, we didn't have any sort of deal anyway. There was something someone was saying about ESPN not now showing the MTK show with Gavin Quinn on.
Well, Bob Aaron was on the Panorama doc, wasn't he? It's speaking highly of Daniel Kinahan, and he's quickly changed his tune. Well, on the surface, he's changed his tune.
This is what I mean. I think it's taken something official, some sort of official sanction. Again, don't want to make light of any current situations going on in the world, but like, you look at Russia and Ukraine, I dare say 99% of those that are now sanctioning Russia would have suspected on some level, or knew, that Putin was up to no good. Like, how many Russian oligarchs and stuff have apparently backed our government, and all the rest? All of this has gone on for years and years and years and years. Well, and now suddenly there's like this, obviously because of these like official, more publicly, I think is the case, like broken international law. Then they've got that excuse to go after them, so they can all turn around and say, well, actually, no, we're not dealing with Russia. We're going to stop sending money. We're going to stop buying goods from Russia. Blah blah blah. And they can all now jump on that side of things, which is why I think this could potentially get that ball rolling. And whether boxing is the same after, I don't know, because depending on where you think MTK and Probellum fighters get their money from, if that money were to dry up, then that's going to leave a massive hole, because it's not going to just be a case of those boxers escape their contracts or get released or whatever. go back to Matchroom in some cases, sign with Frank Warren, whoever. Like, yeah, there are other boxing promoters out there, of course there are, but I don't think there are too many out there with the money to hoover up what is almost all of the best talent. Like, you look at for example, I'm just trying to think of a recent example, and again, got to be careful because Conlon Boxing have released a statement saying that they're like not involved with MTK or Kinahan, yet I don't feel bad saying I would have, until I'd seen that statement, I was under no illusion that they were still sort of working with MTK and that there'd be no official documentation to that. But when Jamie Conlon, who worked in a sort of managerial advisory role at MTK, split off to form Conlon Boxing, and Mick Conlon, like, obviously being the essential boxer there, like, I don't think it's anything outside of him promoting his own fights, basically. But I wouldn't have blinked twice if you'd said, oh, that's like Daniel Kinahan, or that's a branch of MTK, or that's something to do with the Probellum split, or whatever. And if that's not the case, and I need to be very careful what I'm saying, if that's not the case, then, like, so be it. But him and then
you would assume there's separation, though. You know what I mean?
Headlining a Matchroom show, you've got Lee Wood training out of the MTK Performance Centre under Ben Davison, who's obviously MTK sort of de facto trainer, training Josh Taylor, like obviously Pat McCormack, Luke McCormack, Mark Dickinson, like lots of MTK affiliated fighters. Ben Davison being a very, very public friend, fan of Daniel Kinahan in the past, it's not hard to see where these sort of informal links get made. And just what you were saying, then that's like, as a boxing fan, you think, oh, I'm going to tune into the Matchroom show, yet that potentially has Kinahan links all the way through, like, to the top of the card. At what point are you bothered or so outraged by Daniel Kinahan's involvement in the sport that you then draw the line and think, well, right, I'm not going to watch any of his fight? And that's just from a fan point of view. That's probably even harder from a promoter's point of view, or a manager or a trainer's point of view.
I know. But then, like, you look at, but they've both released statements, and obviously there's going to be degrees of separation, isn't there? And I think these are the things that how it's going to be interesting to see how it does play out and if any links are proven. But MTK and Probellum have obviously both released statements in the last 2 days, and I guess for now nothing changes, same as it ever was. And they've released the statements, and on we go. MTK show tomorrow night, Probellum show next Friday night. You have to take them statements as word and see what happens now.
It's not necessarily it's not just that from a fan's point of view, take them as word. You can be as cynical and as dubious about those statements as you want, but from that legal point of view, if there is no paper trail, if there's no link back to Daniel Kinahan, because let's be clear, like, to be a boxing advisor or whatever it may be, to tell a fighter, oh, I think you should take this fight, or you should hold out for this money, or again, I'm totally speculating here, I'll give you this amount, or I'll loan you this, or whatever. You don't need a British Boxing Board of Control license. You don't need to be licensed as a boxing trainer, a manager, whatever. So you're not really punishable by the sport of boxing. So I dare say, like, it's going to
be... Is anyone punishable by the sport of boxing? People gets punished now. Look at the comments.
Again, like, all jokes aside, this is part of the problem, isn't it? You can have any man and his dog having some sort of influence over fighters, and as long as the fighters themselves are happy with it, then it's going to be very hard to track and trace. I was going to say there, but that's going to be the battle from, like, a prosecution side of things, whether they can trace these things back and they can pin them down. And if they can, and if that does happen, then that's going to see this, like, parabolic shift in the sport of boxing.
I think it's a case of watch the space, isn't it, really? Over the years, that my argument about it is
can't hear you, you've gone.
Oh.
Yeah.
But, like, my argument over the years has just been like, I'd probably check them all compass before I attend the Probellum or an MTK show.
Come closer.
You know what I mean? And am I there?
Yeah, you are when you lean in.
Hello.
Yeah, you can't lean back.
Lean back. I know, and I just think, it's just going to be interesting, isn't it? And, it's a subject that I'm going to have to address carefully, sensitively on Twitter, because it does trigger a lot of people, and you have to be careful.
I think it's hard as well on Twitter to sort of voice what we're talking about now in those limited characters. Like we've, as I said, like joked about a little bit before and mentioned, like obviously, like you covered Probellum, so like there's a show up in the Northeast with several high-profile Northeast fighters who are signed to Probellum. So like if we were that sort of outraged at this potential involvement of Kinahan, do we then say, well, actually, no, we're not going to cover this? And it's not, like, to be honest with us, it's not even about getting the clicks or the attention, really, because we don't do it in that sort of bigger numbers to even make a difference. It's just about covering, like, fighters we know personally. And wanting to, like, interview them, wanting to chat to them, go to the show, etc. But then I think, like, you've obviously messaged me about this before, haven't you? Like, I think other than an outlet like ours or even the bigger ones, do they just ask the questions? Do they like ask about the involvement and then move on and do like an interview with, say, the likes of Lewis Ritson, Troy Williamson, whoever, like we would do? Do they ask every time they interview these Probellum or MTK fighters about Kinahan's involvement? Is that something that they do consistently? And I don't know. It's hard. It's almost a whataboutery, but then it's also like being consistent with your approach and like, your feelings on the matter.
I think there's a lot of similarities, right, to a point, and I'm not saying, to the like Newcastle United takeover that we've just witnessed, and as Newcastle fans, and it's that line between sport and morals. Do you know what I mean? And what journalists and people class as sport washing, and Eddie Howe gets it on a weekly basis at his press conferences, and it's died down a bit recently, but I have no doubt that if Newcastle become good and successful and win things, it'll increase ever more because people don't want the Saudis in football because they don't like what they stand for.
And that again links back to some of these examples of the fighters that are like championing Kinahan's involvement in the sport and in their careers. They're the ones that are saying like, and like John O'Carroll is, as I say, it's almost like respect him for his honesty. It doesn't paint him in a good light morally, but then a lot of boxing and boxers aren't like moral people. Like that sounds horrible, weird to say, but like for him to be literally just saying like, I don't care what he's being accused of and what he's up to. Like I'd have to read the tweets to get it, word for word. But for him to be like, well, actually, I don't care about any of that because he's treated me well. It's like that's where it's totally skewed, and as I say, that's where sport washing becomes so effective because, like, the Saudi government, for all the things they've been accused of, like now have like thousands of Newcastle fans defending them on Twitter and stuff, and like as much as I love Newcastle, it's baffling to see, and again, that might be hypocritical. Like I can sit here and criticize the government and criticize what they've been accused of, etc., etc. But I'll still be in the queue for my season ticket next season, trying to get back in the ground. Like,
are you gonna try? Like,
100%, I like. But guys, I need to tell the wife that, Brian. Like, but that's like again, joking aside, that's the sort of the nature of it and why sport washing is so effective. And as I said earlier, why boxing is the perfect target for that.
Yeah. Anyway, I think we've gone off a bit of a tangent there, but no, it's a good discussion, and it's one that people and outlets a lot bigger than ours are probably going to have in the next few weeks and stuff, and it'll be interesting to see how boxing handles it. I think this and next weekend and what discussions certain networks, certain people give it and how much airtime it gets, and it's going to be an interesting few weeks and months, I have no doubt. But as of now, watch your space, innit?
Yeah, and I think obviously we are sort of moving slightly on from this, like sideways into Tyson Fury against Dillian Whyte, because we're going to just chuck this in now and we'll chop it up, I think, and release it separately as a sort of preview of that fight as well, because